This is the last thing in the agenda, I think. It's the debate that collecting locally is usually best. We've got 6 wonderful speakers that are all very well credentialed, so give them a hand to start with. Volunteering for a debate's never a happy thing to do, but they've all done so. So we're going to give them 5 minutes each to speak. I'll ding a bell at 4 minutes, and then I'll ding it twice at 5 minutes. And if they're still talking at 5 minutes 30, I'll kick them off the stage. I'll give them all a minute in between, and hopefully I'll just sort of give you some facts in between each speakers that will give them a bit of time to jot down something to maybe rebut the other side or what they've just heard. It won't be too aggressive, this debate, I don't think. It's not likely to end up in fisticuffs, botanists and ecologists.
You have too high expectations.
Yeah. All right. So anyway, we'll get going. The 4 team usually starts first. So I'd like to introduce Katrina Roberg. Give her a round of applause as she starts.
It's on? Hello, everyone. Thank you for the Against team for giving us such a fabulous set of arguments for why we should be collecting local primarily. First of all, it's a little bit simpler. None of this is simple, but when I work in the practitioner area, I support this work to be done on a very shoestring budget with hardly any time and lots of really enthusiastic employees with incredible skill. But somehow we have to find unfunded time to plan our projects. We have to find unfunded time to develop the species list. And then we need to have unfunded time to determine what provenance all those species come from. And usually unfunded time to record the data of what we've planted. Keeping it a little bit simpler makes it a lot easier to do all of this work with hardly any resource. The reason it's a little bit simpler is, I guess, there's a few different reasons. One is we've already got a relationship with that, the landscape that we're working in, and we're defining local as the historical context of where that population of plant that we're planting would have been originally. And as practitioners, we're familiar with that landscape, so we can work with the nurseries to make sure that we're collecting seed from the various different populations within that population, so different areas. Resource to do the genetic studies and stuff is not available, although maybe we need to talk with some of our colleagues here to work out how we can actually do genetic testing to help selecting the genetics of the plants that we're using. So what we've seen is that we've been pretty successful in collecting local provenance plants and using local provenance plants for successful regeneration. And I think if you look along the Merri Creek, you can see the fantastic work that our crews have done along with all of our partners and a lot of other practitioners here who are doing excellent work. Not to say that there isn't room for improvement, and there isn't. There's definitely. It's very important for us to be looking more and more carefully at the genetic landscape that we're collecting from and the genetic makeup of the plants that we're putting in the ground. And we've been doing that by developing partnerships with Vink, who's our primary supplier of plants, and not to say that there may not at some points be opportunity, or there may not be at some points the need to bring in plants from other, or animals, I guess. I'm really talking about plants here, from other wider populations. But yeah, I think it just, let's stick with local provenance while we've until we've got a massive amount of resources to be able to, and systems set up to be able to learn from the work that's being done about the benefits for widening that. And that's it.
So give Katrina a round of applause. Thanks for that. We'll move on to the against side. And up next, we'll just skip through that, is Rebecca Jordan. So come and do your best.
Thanks so much, and thanks again for opening up there. I guess, so we're arguing why you should think about not using local. And I suppose we're going to slightly shoot the debate in the foot here a little bit and say we're not talking about totally disregarding local. What we're talking about is including, in addition, some non-local. And I just want to start sort of the example. So I'm a Melburnian born and bred, which means when I look at the weather forecast in the morning, I go, yeah, okay, you reckon it's going to be 15 degrees. But you know what? It's city of 4 seasons one day. I'm going to chuck a jumper in just in case. And you know what? Might even rain, so I'm going to chuck an umbrella in. But it might actually also get sunny, so I'm going to wear a couple of layers in case I need to lose a layer, and I'm going to chuck my sunnies in. And so when we're thinking about non-local, this is really what we're thinking about. The fact that we're not working in a static system. What is there now is not what was there 500 years ago. It's not what's going to be there in 500 years. So in order to address that, we really need to be hedge betting. We need to be thinking about putting enough diversity into that system to create something that has enough dynamics, enough of a toolkit, so that it can adapt to whatever changes occur in the future, whether they be anthropogenic or biotic or any other changes that may come along. And so in thinking about this as well, we're also thinking that our lovely colleagues here made the great point that there is some fantastic restoration that is currently going on. But part of the problem is, especially with some of our really, really long-lived species, some of our trees, for example, just because they're surviving now doesn't necessarily mean they will into the future. We don't know. We don't have that data yet. We don't have those really, really long-term studies. So we're still wanting to make sure that we have some of that variation that we were talking about earlier, that we can keep monitoring and figuring out which bits are going to be the best to put in and which bits are going to be that long-term successful, irrespective of what's happening right now. And I'm not sure how I'm going for time, but I think I'm going to wrap up and leave some of the other points to my other colleagues. But the really key thing that we really want to get across is this dynamic nature. We're needing to keep in the fact that we don't know. The only certainty we have is uncertainty, and we need to be thinking about that we have a dynamic system and not trying to capture a static system that we know is not going to be the same in the future, even if we don't know what that change is.
Thanks, Rebecca. Up next for the 4 team is Amanda. So welcome Amanda to the stage. Or if you want to, run around, that's fine. Oh, Amanda's name.
Ooh.
Sorry, I'll go down.
Oh, I wanted my picture. Oh.
We
can stay later for Hugh because he's gone and done all that lovely work. So thanks again to the Against team. But I feel like I've just been sold by an insurance salesman. We're hearing terms like hedging our bets. Didn't hedge funds cause the global financial crisis? Are we hedging our ecological bets, and is that going to cause our ecological crisis? I don't know about you, but it's a bit scary to me. So for my projects, I'm still going to be trying to retain local provenance within the populations of the historical context before fragmentation. I don't know about you, but we've been doing restoration projects out there with Rick for many, many years now in our grasslands out in the Western Plains of Melbourne. And unfortunately, my data collection is really, really bad. And I'm having a guess that also where I work at one of the local councils, our long-term knowledge of our restoration projects is also equally as bad. And probably all of our public-private land owners have probably done revegetation projects which are also just as bad. So other than going back to our lovely nurseries and going through their financial records about what we paid for, that's probably about the only way we're ever going to find out where our provenance came from. And while I appreciate that we might be able to improve that situation, I don't hold out huge bets. If we then go and add in a whole bunch of other stuff, how are we going to know what is weeds? We currently have enough weeds to deal with. We go start putting in weeds that look like native things but have hybrid vigour or have things that don't get eaten by all the bugs. How are we actually going to know what we're fighting for? I don't know if any of you have tried to find chili needlegrass outside of its flowering season, but it's pretty difficult. You go and put in something that looks like a good thing that's not really a good thing because its genetics are a bit mucked up, then that's even worse. I personally think that the problems that we face for ecological restoration are about funding, and they're about getting more plants in the ground. Last year, my community conservation organisation planted 6,000 button wrinkleworts in 1 year. That is amazing. That is probably one of the largest restoration projects that I know of for that species. Now, we've had some researchers tell us, what about the genetics? What about the genetics? I at least now know that I've got a population of 6,000 button wrinkleworts. If you want to come and study the research and look at the genetics, go for your life. But I'm happy walking in my paddock, seeing my recruiting button wrinklewort plants. So anyway, that's the end for me. I just wanted to say, again, thanks to the opposing team, and collecting locally, in my mind, is usually best. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. That was really good. Up next is Liz. Hard act to follow.
I think our opposition has had experience in this debating. So I think there you see. So we're arguing that, in fact, you shouldn't restrict yourself to local provenance. As Beck said, there are reasons for including a wider range of samples if you're doing your revegetation. And one reason for that is that in previous times, a lot of the populations that you would consider local are really part of a much larger population that is now fragmented. So what we want to propose by not restricting to local provenance is that you restore the connectivity that would have been there previously in a population that is much more connected than it is now, but most importantly, that it was just recently. And I think the volcanic plains of Victoria are a great example of this, where there are very remnant fragments of species like Pimelia spinescens that previously were probably almost widespread across those volcanic plains. So we don't want to use local provenance for some of those populations because we're actually artificially restricting the gene pool for those restoration projects. By using just local, we also think that you could interpret that as doing nothing at all, because the risk of doing nothing by using just local stuff is less of a risk than bringing in material from outside. But in fact, we consider that the risk of doing nothing is very great, and we'd like to see the use of genetically diverse material so that what's there now might still be there in 10 years. Your 6,000 might have gone down to 600. But we want those next generations to also have the adaptive capacity to deal with change, and that's where we need to rely on those broad evolutionary systems and processes that have been in place to sort through the genetic variation to create the vegetation systems that we have now. And you did mention hedge funds. And yes, a lot of us didn't do well with the hedge funds, but at the same time, you would have to agree that they brought about better checks and balances within the financial system. And perhaps by doing some well-targeted experimentation, we can also bring about some better checks and balances in our response to dealing with these vegetation changes and climate change. So I think I might leave it there, because I'm sure you've got something to say, Randall.
Thanks, Liz. And that was an excellent display of rebuttal. So now, summing up for the 4 team is Dr. Randall Robinson. So take it away, Randall.
Doing nothing. Doing nothing. 30-some years ago, this young man right here, sitting in the front row, Jeff Carr, and I started a discussion with a bunch of other people about revegetation, restoration, how local is local. And I think that's really key to what we've been talking about today. What is local? So even in Liz's argument, she seemed to be implying right here, this is local. But as we've heard repeatedly, we have to change our concept of what is local. Is local just here? Is it 5Ks? No. That's clearly established by the work that's been presented today. So Liz mentioned population structure and also discrete units. So when we look at the historical context of all of this, Eucalyptus meliodora, no structure across its range. Am I correct? Yeah. So local is there. I constantly use the term for Acacia dealbata on the Yarra River. It's probably all one gene pool. Why are we worrying if it comes from Westerfolds Park or Lilydale? The seeds are flowing down the river all the time. It's a clonal plant. Get real. But we also have the opposite end of the population range. The family Rutaceae, Corias, Phibaliums, and things like that are very localized populations, and their distribution is based on their pollination, on their dispersal mechanisms, and they're very localized, have very specific genetic structure. They're the ones we worry about. Themata, Danthonia, Rhytidosporum, is it now called? Whatever. What is the new name for Danthonia? Rhytidosperma. I'm getting rusty. Maybe not such a big deal. The different Banksias that a couple of us have talked about today. So maybe we need to change our conceptual framework of what is local. That's important. So we now have not only the genetic considerations of how local is local, but the biological considerations that we as practitioners can do. We don't have to rely on the geneticist to know what a pollination mechanism is. We do need to improve on getting our information better. So we have, back in the early 80s, we didn't have people doing genetic testings that could inform us. We do now. IFA, how do we get that out to the main group better? That's important. Let's see. I wanted to thank the negative team and the people that could have potentially been there. Ari, thank you very much for the direct quote, "Local is best." I wrote it down. Maurizio, you explained very well the importance of local and looking more broadly. Thank you. Thanks, Liz, for all your work as well. And Rebecca. And Linda. I'll get there, you. Thank you very much for including local is best in all your future scenarios, planning scenarios. And I don't know if I need to go on any more about any of this. Thanks for the insurance sales. That's great. I wrote a couple of things down as I go. That's enough. Thank you.
Thanks, Randall, and well done on making the 4-minute mark. And finally, summing up.
Dragging it along. Okay, I just want to thank the gardeners here. No, actually I can't say that. And I want to remind you also from a scientific point of view, it is crucial and critical to everything that we do, the experience and expertise that comes from people on ground. That's where really most of the information comes from. And so I really want to acknowledge that. We couldn't do what we do without all that information. And because I'm concluding, I want to be a little bit more serious, and I want to say that this is the debate that is most in agreement that I've ever seen. Pretty much we are saying the same thing. We're trying to find ways to say that we think differently, but we don't. I don't think we do. And it is a combination, and it's case-specific, and it's about having the right information for making the right decision. It's not about having dogmatic position or prescriptive ideology. But there's one issue that has come across, I think, particularly from the team for the Locally is Best, and it's one of expertise, not expertise, again, not from lack of expertise, but one of resources. And this is really the issue. I think you both brought it up at the beginning, that, you know, at the end of the day, local is best because it's more accessible and is something that you can rely upon. And really this boils down to the issue that the resources available that and let's get a little bit more political here, the resources that are made available by local councils, local governments, federal government for restoration are really not adequate. They're not adequate because they're all about ticking boxes, maximizing outputs for minimum inputs. And that's what's wrong. That's where the limitations are. That's why at the end of the day, you don't have the latitude to experiment with non-local. You cannot access non-local. That's what the real issue is. So I think what we need to think as a community is, how do we change that? How do we put this thing upside down and we try to drive it from whoever produces, collects, or the nurseries? You know, if there is sufficient funds, then you can establish something like an accreditation system where you follow through the type of material that you have choices, and then the communities, the groups that are doing the restoration can choose accordingly and follow specific guidelines. Because at the end of the day, there's all those legislative limitations on what to plant, but there is no support to actually help the practitioner to do that. You cannot go and collect from 100 kilometers away if you don't have the resources and if no one has got money to pay $1 per seedling, right? So maybe that's what we need to think about. Maybe that's a good concluding note, and I'll leave you to that.